James Carter, 48, stood at the threshold of the Monroe County Courthouse, his shadow stretching long across the cracked linoleum floor. The Georgia sun beat down outside, but inside, the air was stale, heavy with the scent of old coffee and worn-out justice. His white shirt hung loose, wrinkled from a night he wouldn't explain, a dark stain of dried blood marking the collar like a silent accusation. His eyes, deep and unyielding, scanned the room with the calm of a man who'd seen too much to flinch. He wasn't handcuffed, but the two security officers flanking him moved so close it felt like they expected him to bolt, or explode. The courtroom was half full, a mix of bored court staff, eager law interns, and a cluster of local police officers slouched in their seats, trading smirks. It was Monday morning, another routine trial in a town where justice often felt like a formality. The left door creaked open, and every head turned as Carter stepped inside, his presence pulling the room taut like a bowstring. He didn't glance at the crowd, didn't acknowledge the whispers or the pitying sigh from a woman in the front row. He just walked, steady and deliberate, to the defendant's chair and sat down, back straight, eyes fixed on the empty judge's bench. Somewhere in the crowd, a child's voice cut through the hum. "Mom, is he a bad guy?" The boy, no older than 5, tugged at his mother's sleeve, his wide eyes locked on Carter. The woman flushed, pulling him close, but the damage was done. A young officer, Daniel Walsh, 32, let out a low chuckle, his uniform crisp but his grin crooked. "Kid's got a point," he muttered, loud enough for the row behind him to snicker. "Look at that face. Guy's straight out of a lineup." The laughter spread, soft at first, then bolder, like ripples on a pond. Carter didn't move. His silence wasn't defiance or fear, it was something heavier, like the weight of a storm gathering in the distance. He'd learned that silence long ago, growing up in Atlanta's West End, where cops patrolled his street like it was enemy territory. At 16, he'd been pinned against a chain-link fence, accused of stealing a bike he'd saved a year to buy. At 19, he'd watched his older brother, Marcus, bleed out on a street corner after a routine stop turned deadly, the officer's report claiming self-defense despite Marcus's empty hands. That loss carved a wound in James that never healed, pushing him to join the FBI, not for glory, but to force the system to face itself. Now, sitting in this courtroom, he felt Marcus's absence like a pulse, steady and accusing, driving him to stay still, to let the room reveal itself. Judge Margaret Hayes, 55, entered with a rustle of robes, her face flushed from a lingering cold. She'd built a reputation as a fair judge, raised in a Savannah family that preached colorblind justice over Sunday dinners. But fairness, she'd learned, was easier in theory than in a courtroom where prejudice hung like humidity. She glanced at Carter, then at the file on her desk, blank except for a single charge, obstructing an officer. No name, no address, no record. Her brow furrowed. "Defendant's name?" she asked, tapping the microphone. No answer. Carter's eyes met hers for a moment, steady and unreadable, then returned to the wall. The clerk, Sarah Thompson, 40, flipped through her notes, her fingers hesitating. Sarah had grown up not far from Carter's old neighborhood, but she'd spent years smoothing her accent, dressing to blend in, trying to erase the girl who'd once dodged the same profiling Carter endured. She whispered to the judge, "No name in the file, ma'am." The room stirred, chairs creaking, as if the absence of a name was a crime itself. Walsh leaned toward another officer, his voice dripping with disdain. "No name, no lawyer? Bet he crawled out of some alley." The crowd tittered again, and Sarah, despite a flicker of unease, let a smile slip. She caught herself, but not before Carter's gaze brushed past her, not accusing, just seeing. Lila Brooks, a 28-year-old law intern with sharp ambition and a sharper phone, snapped a quick photo of Carter, her thumbs already typing a caption for her group chat, "Silent Thug Vibes." "Ready for the show?" Judge Hayes cleared her throat, trying to reclaim order. "Do you wish to make a statement before the charges are read?" Carter shook his head, a single, deliberate motion. The room felt heavier, as if his silence was a mirror reflecting their own assumptions. Hayes leaned back, unsettled but unsure why. She didn't know that James Carter had spent years planning this moment, that every laugh, every sneer, was a thread in a tapestry he'd woven to expose the system's rot. He sat there, the weight of his brother's memory anchoring him, knowing the real trial wasn't his, it was theirs. The Monroe County Courthouse buzzed with a restless energy, like a theater before the curtain rises. James Carter sat unmoving in the defendant's chair, his blood-stained collar catching the fluorescent light, a stark contrast to the polished wood around him. His silence, heavy and deliberate, seemed to pull the room's attention despite itself, like a magnet drawing iron filings. The crowd, court staff, officers, and interns, leaned into their whispers, their laughter growing bolder as the trial dragged on without a word from the man they'd already judged. Officer Daniel Walsh, 32, stood near the back, his arms crossed, a smirk playing on his lips. He'd grown up in a family of cops, his father a sheriff who taught him that strength meant control, and control meant never questioning the badge. To Walsh, Carter was just another suspect, another face to pin a story on. He pulled out his phone, queuing up a body cam clip from the night of Carter's arrest. "Check this out," he said, loud enough for the nearby officers to lean in. The grainy footage showed Carter in a dark alley, hands raised as ordered, but Walsh's voice barked, "Resisting. He's resisting." A kick followed, then the screen cut to black. "Corrupted file," Walsh grinned, winking. "Convenient, huh?" The officers around him chuckled, one slapping his shoulder. "Gold," another said, shaking his head. "Put a filter on that, Danny. TikTok's waiting." Walsh's grin widened as he tapped his phone, adding a laughing emoji over Carter's stoic face and uploading it to a private group chat. The caption read, "Silent thug thinks he's a star." Within minutes, notifications pinged, likes, shares, and comments piling up. "Looks like a wannabe gangster," one officer typed. "Bet he's got a rap sheet longer than my arm," another added. Sarah Thompson, the court clerk, caught herself laughing along, her pen pausing over the trial notes. She'd spent years distancing herself from her roots in Atlanta's South Side, where she'd seen kids like Carter profiled daily. She'd traded her old neighborhood for a desk job, believing it meant she'd made it, that she was above the fray. But now, hearing Walsh's taunts, she felt a pang of guilt, sharp and fleeting, like a splinter under her skin. She glanced at Carter, his eyes fixed forward, unmoved by the jeers. For a moment, she wondered what he was holding back, but the laughter around her drowned the thought. Lila Brooks, the law intern, was already scrolling through her phone, her post of Carter's photo now viral in her law school group chat. "Courtroom drama alert, guy's got no lawyer, no name. Who invited the homeless act?" She'd grown up in suburban Atlanta, her ambition fueled by dreams of a corner office, not justice. The likes rolled in, feeding her ego, but something about Carter's stillness nagged at her. She pushed it down, typing another caption, "Bet he cracks by lunch." The room's laughter felt like applause, and she leaned into it, craving the attention. Judge Margaret Hayes tapped her gavel lightly, her face tight with irritation. She prided herself on running a fair courtroom, but the undercurrent of mockery was familiar, almost routine. She'd seen it before, defendants dismissed before they spoke, especially black men like Carter. Her Savannah upbringing had taught her to believe justice was blind, but she'd never questioned why the scales tipped so predictably. "Order," she said, her voice lacking conviction. Carter's gaze flicked to her, just for a second, and she felt a chill, like she'd been caught in a lie she hadn't told. Carter sat through it all, his silence a fortress. Each laugh, each shared video, felt like a stone thrown at his brother's memory. Marcus's face flashed in his mind, smiling at 19, full of dreams, before a bullet stole him. James had joined the FBI to ensure no one else's brother became a statistic, but the mockery around him proved how deep the rot ran. He clenched his jaw, not in anger but in focus, knowing every word, every smirk, was being recorded, not just by cameras, but by his memory, fueling the plan he'd set in motion years ago. Project Mirror wasn't just a test, it was his vow to Marcus, a promise to let the system expose its own ugliness. As the laughter swelled, he felt the weight of his silence, heavy but necessary, knowing it would soon turn their jeers into silence of their own. The Monroe County Courthouse felt like a pressure cooker, the air thick with the smug satisfaction of a crowd that thought it held the upper hand. James Carter sat in the defendant's chair, his blood-stained shirt a silent rebuke against the polished veneer of the courtroom. His eyes, steady as granite, fixed on a point no one else could see, absorbing the jeers and laughter like a man who'd learned to weather storms without flinching. The room's mockery had reached a fever pitch. Officer Daniel Walsh's TikTok clip of Carter's arrest was now looping on a phone in the back, the sound of sarcastic rap music mingling with scattered chuckles. Judge Margaret Hayes shifted uncomfortably on the bench, her fingers tracing the edge of the blank file before her. Carter's silence, his lack of records, gnawed at her. She'd seen countless defendants, but none like this, no protest, no plea, just a presence that seemed to pull the room's hypocrisy into sharp relief. She cleared her throat, about to call for order, when the courtroom door swung open with a soft creak, silencing the chatter. A woman stepped inside, unremarkable in a plain gray blouse and worn beige flats. She carried no briefcase, no badge, just a white envelope, unmarked and unassuming. Her steps were steady, unhurried, like a clock ticking toward an inevitable moment. No one stopped her, not Walsh, who froze mid-laugh, nor the security officers, who seemed to sense something beyond their pay grade. She walked straight to Carter, placed the envelope on the table before him, and turned to leave, the door closing behind her as if it had been waiting. The room held its breath. Sarah Thompson, the clerk, gripped her pen, her heart racing. She'd laughed with the others, but now her stomach twisted, a memory surfacing of her childhood friend, profiled and arrested for nothing but walking home. She'd buried that guilt to climb the ladder, but Carter's stillness and this strange delivery cracked her carefully built facade. Lila Brooks, the intern, lowered her phone, her viral post suddenly feeling like a weight in her pocket. She whispered to a fellow intern, "Who was that?" but got no answer, only a nervous shrug. Carter didn't touch the envelope immediately. His hands rested on his lap, his posture unchanged, but his eyes shifted, less patient, more alert, like a predator sensing the wind change. He'd been waiting for this moment, the first thread of his plan pulling taut. In his mind, Marcus's voice echoed, a memory from their last night together, laughing over cheap pizza, dreaming of a world where justice wasn't a privilege. That dream had died with Marcus, but James had carried it into the FBI, building Project Mirror to expose the system that failed his brother. This envelope was the signal that the stage was set, that the system's arrogance was about to become its own indictment. He opened the envelope, pulling out a single sheet of paper. One word stared back at him in black ink: prepared. No signature, no flourish, just a confirmation that his 3-year plan was unfolding as intended. He folded the note, tucking it back into the envelope, and set it down like a piece of evidence no one else could touch. The room watched, uneasy, as if the air itself had thickened with unspoken questions. Walsh broke the silence, his voice sharp with bravado. "What's that, your fan mail?" A few officers snickered, but the laughter felt forced, hollow. Judge Hayes leaned forward, her voice clipped. "Mr. Carter, do you have anything to present?" Carter's gaze met hers, not defiant but piercing, as if he saw through her to the system she upheld. He shook his head, a single motion that carried the weight of a verdict. Hayes sat back, her unease growing, sensing the trial was slipping from her control. Carter's heart thudded, not with fear but with purpose. Each laugh, each sneer, was a brick in the wall of evidence he'd built. He thought of Marcus, his brother's laughter fading into the sound of sirens, and felt a pang of grief mixed with resolve. He'd endured worse than this courtroom, years of slurs, dismissals, and doors slammed in his face at the FBI, all while climbing to a position where he could force change. This moment, this envelope, was the pivot point. He wasn't here to defend himself, he was here to let the system indict itself, and the weight of that truth made his silence louder than any shout. The Monroe County Courthouse had become a stage, its actors unaware of the script they were playing out. James Carter sat at the defendant's table, the envelope marked prepared resting like a silent grenade in front of him. The room pulsed with smug laughter, Officer Daniel Walsh leading the charge with a fresh TikTok edit of Carter's arrest looping on his phone, captioned "Thug's Big Day." The crowd's jeers, laced with racial undertones, bounced off the walls, each one a nail in the coffin of their own credibility. Judge Margaret Hayes gripped her gavel, her knuckles white. She'd sensed something off from the start, Carter's silence, his unreadable gaze, but she'd pushed it aside, trusting the system she'd served for decades. Now, as the laughter grew, she felt a crack in that trust, like a hairline fracture in glass. "Order," she said, her voice sharper than before, but it barely cut through the noise. Sarah Thompson, the clerk, stared at her notes, her earlier laughter now a bitter taste in her mouth. She remembered her brother's friend, arrested for nothing, and saw her own complicity reflected in Carter's stillness. Lila Brooks, the intern, clutched her phone, her viral post now a burning regret, her ambition tainted by the crowd's cruelty. Carter's hand moved, slow and deliberate, to the black briefcase beneath his chair. The room didn't notice at first, too caught in its own performance. He clicked it open, the sound soft but sharp, like a blade being unsheathed. From within, he drew a gleaming badge, silver-rimmed, eagle insignia, pristine. He held it up, not with flourish but with the weight of truth. The room froze as the words caught the light, "James Carter, Director, Federal Bureau of Investigation." Silence crashed over the courtroom like a tidal wave. Walsh's phone slipped from his hand, the mocking video still playing, now absurdly out of place. His smirk vanished, replaced by a pallor that made his uniform look oversized. Sarah's pen dropped, rolling across her desk, her breath caught in her throat as she realized she'd laughed at a man who could dismantle her world. Lila's phone buzzed with notifications, but she couldn't look, her eyes locked on Carter, her stomach churning with the weight of her own post. Judge Hayes leaned forward, her face ashen. "Mr. Carter," she stammered, "is this authentic?" Carter's gaze met hers, not angry, not triumphant, just empty, a mirror reflecting her failure to see. He nodded once, deliberate, and spoke, his voice low but cutting through the silence like a knife. "You should have stayed as silent as I did." The words landed like a verdict, not on Carter, but on the room. Walsh staggered back, his bravado crumbling as he realized he'd mocked the man who could end his career with a phone call. Sarah's hands trembled, her mind flashing to her childhood, to the time she'd turned away from injustice to make it, in a system that now felt rotten. Lila felt tears prick her eyes, her ambition exposed as shallow, her viral post a stain she couldn't erase. Carter's heart ached, not for himself but for Marcus, whose death had driven him to this moment. He'd joined the FBI to honor his brother, to force a system that killed him to face its flaws. Project Mirror was his creation, a 3-year plan to expose bias by letting it run unchecked, and this courtroom was its crucible. The badge in his hand wasn't just proof of his title, it was a symbol of the system's betrayal, of the brother he couldn't save. He felt a fleeting triumph, but it was tempered by grief. Would Marcus have wanted this, a victory built on silence and sacrifice? The room remained frozen, the air thick with shame. No one moved, no one spoke, because they knew the trial wasn't Carter's. They had been the ones on trial, their laughter and prejudice laid bare under the cold light of his badge. Carter sat back, his posture unchanged, but the room had shifted. The system he'd exposed now stared into its own reflection, and the weight of that truth was heavier than any gavel. The Monroe County Courthouse stood silent, the echo of James Carter's words, "You should have stayed as silent as I did," still reverberating in the stunned courtroom. His FBI director badge gleamed on the table, a cold, undeniable truth that had shattered the room's arrogance. Officer Daniel Walsh stood frozen, his phone on the floor, its mocking video now a haunting reminder of his hubris. Sarah Thompson, the clerk, clutched her desk, her earlier laughter now a knot of shame in her chest. Lila Brooks, the intern, stared at her phone, her viral post a digital albatross, its likes and shares now accusations. Judge Margaret Hayes sat slumped, her robes heavy with the weight of her failure. She'd prided herself on fairness, but her inaction had let prejudice fester under her watch. She wanted to speak, to reclaim control, but the words caught in her throat. Carter's gaze, calm and unyielding, seemed to see through her, exposing the cracks in the justice she'd sworn to uphold. The courtroom doors remained open, but no one dared leave, as if movement would cement their guilt. Within hours, the system began to unravel. At the FBI's Atlanta field office, screens flickered as access codes were revoked. Walsh's department email locked with a red banner, "Access denied, Tier 0 clearance required." His personnel file, once brimming with commendations, was now tagged under review. He sat in the precinct break room, staring at his phone, the TikTok clip he'd posted now deleted but mirrored across platforms, each share a nail in his career's coffin. He thought of his father, a sheriff who'd taught him to control the streets, and felt a hollow ache. Had he been controlling, or just controlled by the same system that failed Carter? Sarah left the courthouse early, her hands shaking as she drove home. She passed the street where she'd grown up, where she'd once seen her cousin harassed by cops for wearing a hoodie. She'd buried that memory to climb the ranks, but Carter's silence had unearthed it. In her apartment, she stared at her court badge, wondering if she'd betrayed her own people to wear it. She opened her phone, seeing the group chat where she'd laughed at Carter's expense, and deleted her messages, knowing it was too late to erase the guilt. Lila, back at her dorm, scrubbed her social media, deleting the post that had gone viral. But screenshots lingered, shared by strangers with captions like "This you?" Her ambition, once a fire, now felt like ash. She thought of her parents, who'd pushed her to make it big in law, and wondered if they'd be proud of a daughter who'd mocked a man for his silence. She drafted an apology email to the courthouse, but her finger hovered over send, fear stopping her. What if Carter saw it? What if he didn't care? Carter sat alone in a safe house outside Monroe, the envelope marked prepared on the table. Project Mirror was unfolding as planned, but the victory felt hollow. He thought of Marcus, his brother's laughter replaced by the sound of a gunshot, and wondered if this was justice or just revenge. He'd spent years in the FBI, enduring slurs and skepticism, building a covert division to root out corruption. But each laugh in that courtroom had been a reminder of how little had changed since Marcus's death. His silence had exposed them, but it had also isolated him, making him a symbol, not a man. By evening, the media caught wind. A local reporter, tipped off by an anonymous source, broke the story: FBI director tried as common criminal in Georgia court. Hashtags like #JusticeExposed and #MonroeShame trended, clips of Walsh's video spreading like wildfire. The public's outrage grew, not just at the officers but at a system that let this happen. Carter read the headlines on a burner phone, his heart heavy. He'd forced the mirror up, but the reflection showed a nation still grappling with its own flaws. He closed his eyes, Marcus's face lingering, and steeled himself for the next phase, knowing the real battle was just beginning. Monroe, Georgia, woke to a quiet that felt like the calm after a storm, but the air was charged with an unspoken reckoning. The courthouse, once alive with laughter, now stood as a monument to exposed shame. James Carter's revelation as FBI director had ripped through the town's law enforcement like a blade, silent but precise. The FBI's Atlanta field office was a hive of activity, screens flashing with red alerts as systems locked down, files sealed, and careers unraveled without a single public statement. Officer Daniel Walsh sat in his apartment, his badge on the kitchen counter, now a useless relic. His department access had been revoked overnight, his personnel file marked non-operational. He'd laughed loudest in the courtroom, his TikTok clip mocking Carter a viral hit among his peers. Now, those same peers avoided his calls, their silence louder than any reprimand. He thought of his father's voice, preaching, "Never back down," but the weight of his own arrogance pressed harder. He'd mocked a man who could erase him with a nod, and the realization left him hollow, staring at a future stripped of the power he'd once wielded. Sarah Thompson stood outside the courthouse, her resignation letter tucked in her bag. She'd quit that morning, unable to face the desk where she'd laughed at Carter's expense. Her childhood in Atlanta's South Side flooded back, her mother's warnings about staying out of trouble, her own choice to blend into a system that demanded conformity. Carter's silence had been a mirror, showing her the cost of that choice. She drove to a community center in her old neighborhood, volunteering to teach kids about their rights, hoping to atone for the laughter she'd let slip. Lila Brooks sat in her dorm, her law school dreams fraying. Her viral post had been deleted, but screenshots haunted her, shared across platforms with captions calling her out. She attended a law reform summit, hoping to salvage her path, but Carter's name echoed in every speech, a reminder of her failure. She scribbled in her notebook, "I laughed because I wanted to belong," the words a confession she couldn't say aloud. Her ambition, once a beacon, now felt like a chain, tying her to a moment she couldn't undo. Judge Margaret Hayes locked her office door, her retirement papers half-drafted. She'd failed to stop the courtroom's prejudice, her fairness exposed as passivity. She remembered her Savannah upbringing, her father's lectures on equality, and saw how hollow they'd been. Carter's badge had been a verdict on her tenure, and the weight of it crushed her resolve. She stared at a photo of her younger self, swearing an oath, and wondered when she'd stopped believing in it. Carter, in his safe house, reviewed encrypted reports from Project Mirror. Leaked documents had hit the press, revealing his 3-year plan to test law enforcement ethics. The trial was no accident, it was a controlled experiment, designed to let bias surface unchecked. He'd anticipated every laugh, every slur, knowing they'd be recorded by hidden cameras and flagged by his team. But the victory was bittersweet. He thought of Marcus, his brother's death the spark for this mission, and felt the ache of a wound that never closed. Had he honored Marcus, or just fed his own grief? The reports showed officers like Walsh removed, systems locked, but the system itself remained, a beast wounded but not slain. The FBI's actions were swift and silent. Walsh's precinct lost access to federal databases, their body cam archives sealed. The state's chief of police, once a local titan, found his office locked, his key card dead. No charges, no trials, just erasure, as if they'd never existed. The media frenzy grew, CNN calling it a system on trial, while ex-posts screamed #JusticeExposed. Carter read the reports, his face impassive, but inside, he wrestled with the cost. He'd exposed the rot, but at the price of his own humanity, becoming a symbol to a world that didn't know his pain. He closed his laptop, Marcus's memory urging him forward, knowing the purge was just the beginning. Monroe, Georgia, was no longer just a small town, it had become a flashpoint, its courthouse a symbol of a nation forced to confront its own reflection. James Carter's trial, exposed as a deliberate test of law enforcement ethics, dominated headlines and X feeds. CNN's ticker read, "FBI Director's Silence Shatters System," while the New York Times ran a stark headline, "The Trial That Judged Us All." Hashtags like #JusticeExposed and #MonroeShame trended, each post a spark in a growing fire of public outrage. Officer Daniel Walsh sat in a bar outside town, his badge gone, his name now a cautionary tale. The TV above the counter replayed clips of his TikTok video mocking Carter, now overlaid with pundits' voices condemning the arrogance of power. Strangers glared, recognizing him from viral screenshots. He'd grown up idolizing his father's sheriff badge, believing it made him untouchable. Now, he felt like a ghost, haunted by his own laughter. He downed his beer, the bitter taste mirroring the regret that gnawed at him, knowing he'd lost more than a job, he'd lost his place in a world he thought he owned. Sarah Thompson stood at a community center podium, her voice shaky as she spoke to a room of teens. "I laughed at a man who deserved better," she admitted, her resignation from the courthouse still fresh. She'd returned to her South Side roots, teaching kids how to navigate a system that profiled them. Carter's silence had broken her silence, forcing her to face the girl who'd once dreamed of justice, not a desk job. She saw Carter's face in the kid's eyes, and it drove her to keep going, to make amends for the laughter she'd joined. Lila Brooks sat at a law reform summit in Atlanta, her notebook filled with quotes invoking Carter's name. A speaker called him the mirror we didn't want, and Lila felt the words cut deep. Her viral post had cost her internships, her reputation tarnished by her own ambition. She'd grown up chasing success, but Carter's trial had shown her the cost of chasing clout. She wrote, "I laughed to fit in, but lost myself, and vowed to study law for change, not status," hoping to redeem her mistake. Judge Margaret Hayes announced her retirement on local news, her voice hollow. "I failed to see the injustice in my own courtroom," she said, her Savannah pride shattered. She'd believed in a blind justice, but Carter's badge had exposed her blindness. At home, she packed away her robes, each fold a reminder of her complicity. She wondered if she could have stopped the laughter, if she'd been brave enough to challenge the system she served. Carter sat in a nondescript hotel room, watching the news on a muted TV. The headlines praised him as a hero, but he felt no victory. Project Mirror had exposed the system's rot, but each report reminded him of Marcus, his brother's death, the fuel for this fight. He'd joined the FBI to change the system, enduring years of slurs and skepticism to build a covert division that could force accountability. But the media's hero worship made him uneasy. He wasn't a savior, just a man who'd lost too much to stay silent forever. He read a tweet, "Carter showed us who we are. Do we like it?" And felt a pang of sorrow. The nation was waking up, but the cost was his own isolation, his pain buried beneath the symbol he'd become. The public's reaction grew louder, protests outside the courthouse, calls for reform, and X-threads dissecting every moment of the trial. A viral clip showed Walsh's video, now captioned, "This is what we're fighting." Carter watched it all, his face unreadable, but inside, he wrestled with the weight of his plan. Marcus's memory pushed him forward, but the headlines made him question if change was possible, or if he'd only exposed a wound too deep to heal. He closed the TV, his resolve firm but heavy, knowing the nation's eyes were on him, and the mirror he'd held up. The Monroe County Courthouse stood quiet, its halls empty of the laughter that once echoed. James Carter's trial had become a national reckoning, its ripples reshaping law enforcement across Georgia and beyond. The FBI had integrated Project Mirror into its training, a mandatory module titled The Cost of Silence. Cadets watched grainy footage of Carter's trial, his stoic face a lesson in what happens when a system fails to see its own flaws. His name was no longer just a headline, it was a standard, a warning etched into the conscience of a new generation. Sarah Thompson stood outside the community center, her resignation from the courthouse now a distant memory. She'd spent weeks teaching kids how to stand up to profiling, her voice steady but her heart heavy with the guilt of her past laughter. She'd seen Carter's face in her dreams, his silence a mirror to her own complicity. Growing up in Atlanta's South Side, she'd dodged the same prejudice Carter faced, yet she'd joined the system that perpetuated it. Now, she wore a button with Marcus Carter's name, a tribute to the brother whose death had driven James's mission. Each class she taught was a step toward redemption, a way to honor the man who'd forced her to see herself. Lila Brooks sat in a law school lecture, her ambition redirected. The summit had changed her, Carter's name a constant reminder of her mistake. Her professors now used his trial as a case study, dissecting systemic bias. Lila wrote papers on reform, her once shallow goals replaced by a drive to serve justice, not chase clout. She'd emailed an apology to the FBI, not expecting a reply, but the act freed her from the weight of her viral post. She saw Carter's silence as a call to action, a reminder that change started with confronting one's own failures. Judge Margaret Hayes moved to a small cabin outside Savannah, her retirement official. She avoided the news, unable to face the headlines that called her courtroom a disgrace. She'd spent years believing in fairness, but Carter's badge had shown her how blind she'd been. She wrote letters to her old colleagues, admitting her failure, but none replied. At night, she dreamed of Carter's eyes, not accusing but exposing, and woke with a resolve to support reform from afar, donating to legal aid groups, hoping to atone for her silence. Officer Daniel Walsh worked a security job at a mall, his police career erased. His name was a whisper in Monroe, a cautionary tale for cops who thought power was permanent. He avoided mirrors, unable to face the man who'd laughed at Carter. His father's voice, once a guide, now felt like a lie. He'd lost his badge, his pride, and his place in the world, all because he'd underestimated a man's silence. He watched reform protests on TV, Carter's name a constant, and felt a bitter shame, knowing he'd been part of the problem. Carter sat by a gravestone in an Atlanta cemetery, Marcus's name etched in weathered stone. Project Mirror had succeeded, officers purged, systems audited, training rewritten, but the cost was etched in his heart. He'd joined the FBI to honor Marcus, enduring years of prejudice to reach a position where he could force change. But each victory felt like a reminder of his brother's absence. He spoke softly to the grave, "Did I do right by you, Marcus?" The wind carried no answer, but the weight of his mission pressed on. He'd exposed the system, but the personal toll, his isolation, his grief, made him question if it was enough. Across the nation, law enforcement grappled with Carter's legacy. FBI academies displayed his trial footage, cadets scribbling notes on ethics, their laughter silenced by the weight of his silence. Agencies like the DOJ and DHS reviewed their protocols, haunted by the red-coded files Carter's team had flagged. The system was reflecting, not because it wanted to, but because Carter had held up a mirror no one could ignore. He remained in the shadows, his presence felt in every cautious step, every rewritten rule, his grief and resolve driving a change that was only beginning. Monroe, Georgia, had settled into an uneasy quiet, the courthouse now a relic of a trial that had changed the nation. James Carter's name was no longer just a headline, it was a whisper in every police precinct, every law school, every corner of a system forced to reckon with its own reflection. His Project Mirror had left an indelible mark, its lessons carved into training manuals and whispered in hushed conversations. Yet Carter himself remained absent, a shadow whose presence was felt more in his silence than in any public appearance. Sarah Thompson stood at a rally in Atlanta, her voice strong as she spoke to a crowd about systemic reform. She'd left the courthouse behind, her resignation a liberation from a system she'd once served blindly. Carter's trial had been her mirror, showing her the girl who'd buried her South Side roots to fit in. Now, she wore Marcus Carter's name on a pendant, a reminder of why she fought. She met families who'd lost loved ones to police violence, their stories echoing Marcus's, and felt Carter's resolve in her own heart. Her laughter in that courtroom was a scar, but one she used to fuel her advocacy, ensuring others wouldn't make her mistake. Lila Brooks sat in a law library, her laptop open to a draft of a reform proposal. Carter's trial had derailed her ambition for prestige, replacing it with a hunger for justice. She'd lost internships, her viral post a stain that followed her, but she'd gained clarity. Her professors cited Carter's case in lectures, calling him the man who rewrote accountability. Lila wrote, "I was part of the problem, but I won't stay there," her words a vow to honor Carter's silence by fighting for change. She applied to public defender programs, determined to serve those the system overlooked, her shame a catalyst for growth. Judge Margaret Hayes lived quietly in her Savannah cabin, her retirement a self-imposed exile. She read news of police reforms, Carter's name a constant shadow. She'd failed to stop the prejudice in her courtroom, and the memory of Carter's badge haunted her. She volunteered with a legal aid group, reviewing cases of wrongful arrests, each one a chance to make amends. She wrote in her journal, "I saw justice but didn't act," and sent anonymous donations to reform groups, hoping to rebuild what her silence had broken. Officer Daniel Walsh stood outside a community center, watching Sarah speak. His security job at the mall was all he had left, his police career erased like a deleted file. Carter's trial had stripped him bare, his laughter a brand he couldn't escape. He'd grown up believing his badge made him invincible, but Carter's silence had shown him how fragile that power was. He wanted to apologize, to explain, but the words felt empty. He watched the rally, Carter's name on signs, and felt a flicker of something new, regret, yes, but also a desire to understand, to be better than the man who'd laughed. Carter sat in a nondescript office, his FBI badge tucked away. He'd avoided the spotlight, letting Project Mirror's results speak for him. The nation had changed, training programs rewritten, officers purged, reforms proposed, but he felt no triumph. Marcus's death, the spark for this mission, lingered in every victory. He'd climbed the FBI ranks, enduring slurs and skepticism, to build a division that could force accountability. But the cost was his own humanity, his grief a constant companion. He opened a file, a new phase of Project Mirror planned, and felt Marcus's presence, urging him to keep going, to ensure no one else lost a brother to a broken system. In FBI academies, cadets studied Carter's trial, his silence a lesson in power. His name was etched on a glass door at headquarters, a quiet monument to accountability. Agencies trembled under his shadow, knowing his team watched, their red-coated files a silent threat. Carter's absence was his strength, his silence a mirror that forced the system to see itself. He stood alone, his resolve unshaken, but his heart heavy with the question, was it enough to honor Marcus, or had he only begun? The sun rose over Atlanta, casting long shadows across the FBI headquarters, where a young recruit named Ethan Hayes, 24, stepped into the third-floor hallway. His suit was crisp, his name tag gleaming, but his steps were tentative, like a man walking into a story he didn't yet understand. He passed a glass door, its surface polished to a mirror's shine, and paused. Etched in faint gold ink was a name, James Carter, Director, Federal Bureau of Investigation. Ethan's breath caught, not from awe but from recognition. He'd read the headlines, seen the viral clips, heard the whispers of a trial that had shaken the nation. Carter's name was no longer just a name, it was a reckoning, a symbol of a system forced to face itself. Ethan had studied the Monroe trial in his ethics class, watching footage of Carter's silence, the laughter, the badge that silenced it all. He'd grown up in a small Georgia town, not unlike Monroe, where justice often looked the other way. His mother had taught him to question authority, but Carter's story showed him how. He touched the glass, seeing his own reflection, and wondered if he was ready to walk the path Carter had carved. In Monroe, the courthouse stood quiet, its halls no longer echoing with laughter. Sarah Thompson had become a local hero, her community center a beacon for reform. She wore Marcus Carter's name on her pendant, a reminder of why she fought. Lila Brooks was in her final law school semester, her reform proposals gaining notice, her shame transformed into purpose. Judge Margaret Hayes sent another donation to a legal aid group, her quiet atonement ongoing. Officer Daniel Walsh enrolled in a restorative justice program, his first step toward understanding the man he'd mocked. James Carter sat in a park, a letter to Marcus in his hand. He'd written it at dawn, the words spilling out after years of silence. I did this for you, but it's not enough. The system's changing, but it took your life to start it. He'd built Project Mirror to honor his brother, enduring decades of prejudice to reach a position where he could force accountability. The nation had shifted, reforms passed, officers purged, training rewritten, but the cost was his own solitude. He folded the letter, his resolve firm, knowing he'd keep fighting, not for glory but for the brothers still at risk. The system continued to reflect, haunted by Carter's silence. FBI academies taught his trial as a cornerstone of ethics, his name a warning to those who'd laugh before looking. Agencies like the DOJ and DHS operated under his shadow, their files flagged with red codes, their actions scrutinized. Carter remained in the background, his presence a quiet force, his grief and purpose intertwined. He'd held up a mirror, and the nation couldn't look away. To everyone who's followed this journey, thank you. You've walked with James Carter through silence, shame, and a systems reckoning. His story isn't just about one man, it's about the mirror we all face, the truths we must confront. If Carter's silence moved you, hit the subscribe button on Revenge Ties and join us, where every story exposes a truth, breaks a chain, and lights a path to justice. Share this tale, leave a comment, and keep questioning the systems around you. Together, we'll keep the mirror up, reflecting a world that can be better.